Every now and then, I meet someone who's changing the world for the better by their sheer will alone. Whether they're authors, activists, or adventurous, these people are blazing a path with their deep enthusiasm and allowing the world to follow. Their passion is strong, and my passion is to tell their stories. I am Brian Platt, and this is Passion Project. So I'm here with Sonia Faruqi. She's the author of The Oyster Thief, which I just finished reading. Welcome, Sonia.
Thanks, Brian. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time out. I just finished reading The Oyster Thief. Loved it. I love the way that you were able to seamlessly combine, some amazing storytelling along with some incredible facts about the ocean. I could tell you really researched it well, and I definitely appreciate that.
Good. I'm so glad you liked it. I really enjoyed writing the book, and it means a lot to me when people enjoy reading it.
Yeah. You went into it briefly in the this amazing section in the back, a beautiful world section that you had, where you wrote about the what caused you to write it, but what's a little background about yourself and what made you write this book? That's a bit of a departure from your first book, which is Project Animal Farm, which is more of a nonfiction.
Yes, I fell into this book. It sounds funny to say, but I live in Toronto, and it was January 1st, 2015. It was a freezing morning. There was snow everywhere, and I had this sudden desire to escape. I envisioned going to the beach, to the water, hearing the sound of the waves and the sound of the gulls and the smell of the salt. And I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't afford to book a last-minute trip. I didn't have the time for that either. So I decided to escape in my mind. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down quite firmly on the couch. And I just started writing my own underwater world. That's where the seed of the idea took place for The Oyster Thief. And over the course of researching the ocean, I became quite enamored with it. It's such a beautiful world out there. It's an area we know very little about. For instance, the average depth of the ocean is 2 miles. It goes down very deep. Much of the ocean is actually dark, and it's lit by bioluminescence. There's so much life down there. There's more than 10,000 kinds of algae. There's millions of species that are still undiscovered of both animals and algae. So it's a mystical world. It's intriguing. It's stunning. And I snorkeled, I dived, I swam with sharks to really try to understand the world and to make it the setting for The Oyster Thief.
Yeah, that was one thing I really appreciated, that I could tell you put in the legwork. I could tell you researched a lot. Was that always there, that that ocean conservation theme? Was that always something you wanted to tackle, or was it just kind of when you first started, like, I kind of want to escape and I would like to go to a different world for a bit?
I'm glad you asked. It's actually not something I've always wanted to tackle. I am the author of Project Animal Farm, which is a work of investigative journalism about factory farms. And that book immersed me into this world of farms and also started to make me very conscious about the environment as a whole. Now, in Project Animal Farm, I explored land and land issues, including animals and animal farms. And that sort of extended me subconsciously toward the ocean, as that is 2/3 of the planet. But really, I wouldn't say I'd ever thought much about ocean issues. And there's so many that exist. I never thought about them properly before starting The Oyster Thief.
Yeah, and that makes sense. It is kind of... it's something that kind of dovetails into what you were writing, the Project Animal Farm book. Yeah, and it's one of those things that, if the oceans go, then we're soon to follow, and a lot of people don't really realize that. And that's what I appreciated about this book, was it talked about the strength of the ocean, but also the vulnerability. And I really appreciated the way you were kind of able to fully tackle both of those sides, that dichotomy of ocean life.
Thank you. Yes, it's very vulnerable. That's a good word. And it's a word we don't usually associate with the ocean because it's so big.
Mm-hmm.
You don't think of something that big being so vulnerable. But so many of our most mundane day-to-day habits, including our usage of plastic and chemicals and sunscreen, and the way we eat and drive, everything does affect the ocean. The human lifestyle today is having the biggest impact on the ocean of anything else. So we are quite imperiling the ocean, and thus are also being imperiled by the changes that we are creating.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And even just by overfishing, people always thought it was inexhaustible. There's no way you could overfish; it's too big. But we find out, quite the opposite. Especially with commercial fishing and things becoming a little bit more rampant. So. Yeah, that's a very, it's kind of a thing that I feel like we've had to come to terms with a little bit more recently.
Yes.
Yeah, so before you were an author, I did a little reading about you. I understood you were an Ivy League graduate, an investment banker. What made you want to change careers? Is this full-time career change? Like I said, I read a little in the preface of the Oyster Thief, and I found your career transition very inspiring. And I just wondered how you came about that, and if it's if it's going to be a permanent change.
It's true. I never expected to write books. I never even liked writing. Growing up, I loved math and science, particularly math. And so Wall Street was the perfect fit for me. I loved Excel. I loved the long hours. I loved the paycheck and living in New York. Everything was good and somewhat glamorous as well. But there was the economic recession in the U.S., and as it turned out, I was a part of that. And the sector was really struggling. So it came down to me to think about what else I wanted to do, at least for the short term. And then it just happened that having always grown up in cities, I'd never been to a farm, and I was curious about where our food comes from. That led me to go to my first farm and find myself quite surprised and disappointed by the animal welfare at the farm. That led me to go to more farms across the world in Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, U.S., Canada, Mexico, Belize, to really understand and to recommend solutions. Now, upon writing that book, which was nonfiction, I found that I really enjoyed the process of writing, the process of creating and distilling thoughts. And so the foray into fiction came out of that. I do find myself writing and enjoying it quite a bit. I do hope to continue it long term. The exact book that might be next, I can never be sure.
Yeah.
But it's certainly something that I find is very meaningful. Books have always played a huge role in my own life and affecting my thoughts and actions. So it's kind of nice to be able to give back in that sense as the writer of books myself now, to be able to influence not only my own self while researching and writing, but also others.
What, if you can even talk briefly about what books might have influenced you, whether it was with this writing process or just, becoming who you are today. Do you have a list of that, or anyone jumps to mind?
Yes. There's a lot of books that I've loved. One author whom I like is Ayn Rand.
Oh.
And people are a bit surprised when I say that. She's associated with the far right. Her area is called philosophical fiction. She wrote The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. I found that not necessarily that I agree with everything she says, but the styles of the stories and how she's able to weave philosophies and ideas and themes really deeply into the plot itself. I found that very skillfully done and really impressive. And her writing has been a bit of a model for me, but not, of course, not the thematic aspects, but the writing itself. Beyond that, I've loved a lot of books, self-development books, The Power of Now by
I saw
Eckhart
that on your
Tolle.
site. That's a great one.
It is so good. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. I'm just taking a look at my bookshelf right now. There's a lot of books on animals too that I've really liked. Temple Grandin's Animals in Translation.
Sure.
It was good about the mindset of animals and trying to delve into that. Rachel Carson's work, A Silent Spring, was lovely. And she's written a trilogy of sea-related nonfiction. I'm also starting to delve into that. But there's so much influence and there's so many good books out there. It's sometimes hard to choose.
Well, yeah, and I'm glad. What I like about yours is a lot. You get this nonfiction, you've got fiction, but yours blends. At least the Oyster Thief blends them perfectly. So I didn't really feel like I had to choose between the two when I was reading yours. I really appreciated that. And it's interesting that your first book was more of like you said, like an expose on farm industry, farming lifestyle. And this one's a novel, and it's a novel about mermaids and underwater living, and just kind of a completely different world. How did the writing process, the research process, how did that differ between the two books?
That's a great question, and there was quite a difference. In Project Animal Farm, I went to farms, and much of the book was inspired by those first-hand farm visits. That said, I also used a lot of other sources to ensure everything was accurate, and there's about 600 references cited at the back of the book. So it's really very substantial research. It took me 1 to 2 years just to do all the research.
Yeah.
Now, in The Oyster Thief, being fiction, the research was done differently, and it's some details here and there interweaved into the story. For instance, the Mer people, their houses are made of stones, and I mean their whole culture of the way they eat and live. Mm-hmm. I looked into the real stones found in the Atlantic and the real animals, the real algae and seashells and all of that. So it was, and I kept an Excel file of everything, different tabs, different color codes for the different areas. I would research it, and then I would think, how is this applicable to the culture of Mer people?
Oh, wow.
For instance, if there's a kind of algae which is good for the thyroid, and we know scientifically that it's good for the thyroid, then I would use that as the protagonist, Coraline, an apothecary mermaid, a healer in essence. She would use that for that purpose. Mm-hmm. So I really tried to combine both science and imagination, first finding out what's there and then seeing how that can actually play a role in the story. And there's a quote by Richard Feynman that the imagination of nature is greater than the imagination of man.
Wow,
and I really found that to be quite true, because there's so much out there. And it's so interesting. In that sense, fact is more interesting than fiction. And I found it productive and illuminating to use fact to inspire fiction wherever possible.
Yeah, I really like that quote. And I like the fact that, I've done a bit of writing myself. And, when you start adding extra themes, like I read that when you decided that you wanted Coraline to be in the Atlantic Ocean, that adds this whole extra, layer of research you now have to do. You can't add,
Yeah.
yeah, you can't add any, any fish or any aquatic life that would not be found in the Atlantic Ocean. So you have to kind of revert back, and with every choice you make, you layer on more research, but it gets more streamlined, it gets more distilled in the end.
Precisely. That's how I went about it. And at times I wasn't sure if it would all come together because there's so many different elements. There's all this research, and the story itself has to be in the foreground, and the characters as well. So there was I was working from multiple different levels, sort of top down and also bottom up, and hoping that they would meet somewhere that would be interesting and enjoyable.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's hard for one person to do. You have to do the research, you have to do the story editing, you have to, do character development and dialogue. Did you, it's writing a book is more collaborative than a lot of people might think. Who was able to help you along the way in that process? Who do you really, did you find very beneficial during that process?
I found it beneficial to talk to people. I would speak to my sister and my brother both quite a lot. They're both avid readers. My sister, I have a twin sister, Sophia. She's a good editor as well, actually, so it was always helpful to get her insights. And my brother is more of a big picture reader, and he had a lot of ideas for characters and twists in the story. So they were both incredibly helpful. And then the beta readers, I had some beta readers in addition to my brother and sister. I recruited them through my newsletter from my website, and they played a really big role in informing the story. I would send them chapters every week, and they would all give me feedback by the next week. And it was personally encouraging to see that that these readers were so interested in seeing the story develop and were waiting for the next installment. And it also helped make the next installment and the overall book much better than it could have been without them. I'm very grateful. I've always been fortunate to work with good and interesting people who play a big role in helping me develop. Yeah,
that's great. That's great insight to to be able to get from your family, and also your newsletter of loyal readers. So that's definitely very helpful. I'd imagine. So the book is published by Penguin Random House. That's one of the big five publishers. How did you establish this connection? How did they help you along the way? How was the process different than would it be with a smaller publisher?
Yes, it's been interesting. I've been with two publishers. My primary publisher is Pegasus Books in New York, and they've been wonderful, very supportive of both Project Animal Farm and the Oyster Thief, although they're quite different books. And in Canada, the publisher and distributor is Penguin Random House, and that's been a good relationship as well. To see more about how the bigger publishers work, and they've both been really terrific to work with. I was connected to Penguin through Pegasus because they focus on the publicity for Pegasus books in Canada, and I was connected to Pegasus themselves through my first book, Project Animal Farm. So I've been quite fortunate to have found good publishers and to see that they're interested and supportive, despite the fact that I'm writing different kinds of books. That makes it a bit harder for publishers because then they have to be more creative with the marketing rather than marketing to the original fan base that might have developed. And that might be interested in the second book if the two books are quite similar. So it's been a good experience with the publishing world for me.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, your writing style's got to change, but also who you're marketing to has got to change between the different books. There's not necessarily going to be an exact overlap between any fiction and nonfiction. Yeah, that's interesting. I never really thought of that.
Well, yes.
So I don't know about you, but oftentimes when I'm writing an article or a story, like ideas for 10 others always seem to come up. Did that happen for you? Did your research kind of take you down a rabbit hole and like, okay, I have to stop that and maybe come back to it later for another story? Or were you kind of really invested in the Oyster Thief as you were writing it?
It was mostly that I was invested in the Oyster Thief, but there are times when it feels easier to look towards something else. That
Yeah.
there's a honeymoon phase with writing a book. The early stages are very good and everything's possible. Then as you go further, you might see that there's a few issues that you need to contend with, whether it's the story or whether a particular scene is just not turning out quite how you'd hoped, or some plot angles that you didn't think about, but that are a bit of a tear in the fabric of the story. So it then feels easier to just move on to something else. But I did stick with it, despite the fact that at one point I did have to abandon the whole book and start over from scratch.
Yeah.
I started it on Jan 1st, 2015, as I mentioned, and I spent about 2.5 years and about 2,000 hours working on the book. But it just wasn't right at that stage. It was reading more for a young audience, and I hadn't really done the research at that stage and integrated it into the book. Then I decided to throw it out, start over with a blank slate, a completely different story, and I spent 3 months planning and researching it very, very closely to make sure that it would all hold. And things did change after that outline, but it was something good to work off.
Yeah. We kind of talked about that briefly before we started recording, but it must have been a bit disheartening to kind of have to reset and change, and start all over again. But I'm sure it was an invaluable, experience. It's 2,000 hours. It could have been 3,000. At least you were able to cut it off and really come out with an amazing story at the end. Yeah,
so you're right, actually. It could have been 3,000. I hadn't thought about that.
Who's to say? That's kind of why it's important to, as invested as you get, or I feel like get into a story, I feel like it's important to kind of pull yourself out and realize, hey, this might not even be, appropriate thing for the character to do or whatnot. So yeah, it's definitely, you came out with something amazing in the end. So in that sense, it's definitely seemed to be all worth it.
Well, thanks, Brian.
Yeah, of course. So what did you learn about yourself? That kind of goes into my next question. What did you learn about yourself through the writing process, or what did you learn about the writing process as you were writing The Oyster Thief? You kind of mentioned a little bit that, you might have to reset a little bit once you've gone down this hole. But was there anything else you kind of got from it?
I did learn that patience is important in writing. In most fields, we have a fairly fast-paced way of doing things. Now, books are different in that everything slows down. Sometimes it's a good idea to even step away and to let something simmer and brew over a couple of days or longer. And I've had more of an appreciation for that now. Previously, I didn't think much about how the subconscious is also playing a role, and the mind is continuing to work on something, even if not actively. So now I try to be more patient. I try to not have deadlines that are too tight for myself, or to put too much pressure on myself that this has to be good or perfect. Because perfectionism, that's another area and a related area where we can really get into a trap, and many writers do, of trying to make something so good, but then it may not even become as good as you think.
Yeah.
And that extra effort can be a bit maddening to just be going in circles over the same sentences, over the same commas and apostrophes.
Right.
So it can be better to just be happy enough with it as far as you can get it, to the best of your ability and to the best of my ability at that point in my life, and then to move on and see what else can be done.
Yeah. It's kind of, we can be our own worst enemy in that sense, so we can just kind of beat ourselves up over, a paragraph or a decision the character makes or something like that, without keeping the larger picture in mind. At least I feel. Well, interesting. Well, what's one of the takeaways that you'd want readers to have after reading The Oyster Thief?
A takeaway that readers should have is the beauty of the ocean. That's what I quite loved about it. It's also a sense of perhaps expanded humanity, because humans are the only humans in the world, or human-like species, in terms of the way we live and the way we relate to the environment, and in several ways we are unique, and in several ways we are unique. So I find it interesting to have this other culture of human-like individuals who live in the natural world and who interact with it quite differently than we do. The ocean is their habitat, and it is just very much a part of their lives, from the animals and the environment to the way they live day to day. It's in harmony with their environment. There isn't this juxtaposition of a man versus nature. So it's just a different relationship, and I hope that helps us think a bit more about our own relationship with the world around us.
Yeah.
And perhaps just stop and notice the beauty of this planet we call home.
Yeah, I love the way you put that, and I also love the way, when you, and I forget what exact chapter it was, but you mentioned, I actually think it was in the end, you mentioned how people are whales and people are more related than people would think, from the way their tails go. They're out, whales and dolphins are outsiders in the ocean. Their tails move up and down, whereas with most fish, they move side to side. And yeah, it's one of those things where we're not as, we don't really consider that we are, you're saying that expanded version of humans. Whales and dolphins aren't humans, but we're a lot closer than most people might think.
Yes, exactly. The interconnectedness of life.
Yeah, that was something I definitely got while reading your book, and it was very heartening. I really enjoyed that aspect. So
Good.
what advice do you have for aspiring writers, for aspiring environmental writers in your field? Was there anything that you came away with, or that you would like, some pieces of advice you'd like to give?
Yes, absolutely. It's important to follow your curiosity and your own heart and skills. So if there's a particular issue you're passionate about, or a particular skill that you have, you can find a way to combine the two together, such that you can have the most impact in your chosen area. And there's a movie, Shark Water Extinction, a documentary.
That's great.
Yes, it's so good. The individual featured in it, Rob Stewart, one thing he said, which was mentioned in the Q&A by one of the people involved in the film, he said that you should smash together what you're good at with what you're passionate about. And I find that's a good way to think about it, so that one can have the most impact. Because if one tries to do something that one is passionate about but is not really using the skills that they have or want to develop, then it can result in some disinterest or a level of burnout even. And so it's important to follow your heart and the mind both. And, we can all do a little bit every day. Changing the world just means really changing ourselves in small ways. In the case of the ocean, it comes down to even the sunscreens that we use, chemicals, and most sunscreens have chemicals, and about 14,000 tons of these chemicals enter the world's coral reefs every year. And we can choose to use mineral sunscreens, which are not made of chemicals and which do not damage coral reefs. We can choose to reduce our usage of plastic, opting for a tote bag instead of a plastic bag. We can rethink our consumption of fish. That is certainly very important in the ocean ecosystems, particularly because many of the species that humans tend to eat, like tuna and salmon, reside at the top of the food chain, and killing them really does have effects throughout. Another issue more broadly is that the oceans absorb about 1/4 of the carbon dioxide on the planet. They give us about half of the oxygen on the planet, while absorbing 1/4 of the carbon dioxide. And so thinking about our carbon emissions and environmental footprint also plays a big role. We can do that by eating lower on the food chain, more plants and less meat and dairy, and also by thinking about other things like transport, maybe trying to use public transport more, or biking or walking rather than cars or flying whenever possible.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different things that we can all really do, and they're fairly simple once you start doing them, but they do have a big effect on the planet.
Yeah, and a lot of those things you can see happening now. I hope they're not trends, but I live by the beach, and most restaurants don't offer straws, or if they do, they offer you paper straws that decompose a lot quicker. Hopefully things are moving in the right direction, but there's it seems like the oceans are being attacked. It's almost death by 1,000 cuts. They're being attacked from so many different angles, from overfishing to, like you were saying, of carbon emissions. So yeah, it's definitely every little bit that we can do helps for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, Sonia, I really wanted to thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I loved reading the book, The Oyster Thief. And I loved even more talking to you about it, and getting your perspectives and getting your advice for new writers and for environmentalists and for anyone interested in this subject. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Brian. I really enjoyed speaking with you. For anyone who is interested in reading The Oyster Thief, you can find the first chapter for free, of course, on my website, soniafaruqi.com. And you can also stay in touch with me on social media if interested, at Sonia_Faruqi. Thanks for talking about these ocean themes, Brian. It's been really good to connect over books and over the environment. And if anyone has any questions, they are welcome to reach out to me, and I'm very happy to be helpful in any way that I can be.
And I can attest that Sonia is incredibly nice. So if you have any questions at all, she's always there, very, very helpful. So thank you so much again for your time. That was incredible, and I was very pleased with this one. So.
Perfect. Thanks.
And take care.